Hello everyone and welcome back. In the last video, we briefly looked at the history of English in order to see how it has changed over the past 1500 years. One of the biggest reasons English is difficult to learn is because it is a quirky language, mainly in its vocabulary. By reviewing the history of English, it's easier to understand why English has become so quirky over the years. In this video, we're going to look more specifically at what those quirks are and what makes them challenging for non-native speakers of English. But first, let's cut English a little bit of slack and look at what makes it easy. First, as I mentioned in the last video, English lost grammatical gender quite a while ago, so it currently has no grammatical gender. Grammatical gender is when a language designates nouns as either male or female, or there are some other categories as well, depending on the language. Since English has no grammatical gender, which makes it different from most of the languages in Europe, it can make it easier to learn for language learners who come from languages with grammatical gender or without, because then they don't have to learn a new system of grammatical gender. For example, in Spanish, there's the masculine gender and the feminine gender. So when a noun is masculine, it'll have an O ending, and when it's feminine, it'll have an A ending. And because of this, it has some consequences for other words in the sentence as well. Because English doesn't have grammatical gender, it doesn't cause problems like this for the other words in the sentence. German is even more complicated as it has masculine, feminine, something in between called neuter, and plural. Also, English has few inflections and limited suffixing. As I also mentioned in the last video, inflections are usually word endings that give us some kind of grammatical information. For example, telling us whether something is the subject of the sentence or the object of the sentence or something else. Suffixing is just general information that gets added at the end of a word that will just add to the meaning of the word somehow. So in English, the suffixing is limited to maybe 2 or 3 suffixes at most, whereas some languages make extensive use of suffixing. For example, if you look here, this is an example from the Turkish language. In Turkish, they can start with a very simple word like kork, which means fear. And by adding suffixes to it, they can eventually get to extremely complicated words that, if we translated it into English, would be even a difficult sentence in English. Also, English requires little agreement between the words in a sentence. For example, between nouns and verbs, nouns and adjectives, nouns and articles, etc. So we do require some agreement between the subject and the verb in a sentence, but not as much as some languages. So if we look at Spanish again, for example, if we have a masculine noun, then that will mean that any adjectives that describe that noun will also have to be masculine. Any determiners that go with the noun will also have to be masculine, and any pronouns that match with it will have to be masculine. So there's quite a bit of agreement that has to go on between the words in a sentence. Likewise, if we've got a feminine noun, then the adjectives have to be feminine, the pronouns have to be feminine, and the determiners have to be feminine. In English, non-native speakers don't really have to worry about this. For example, the word small is small no matter what the noun is that it goes with. Now, let's look specifically at what makes English difficult for non-native speakers. Now, when anyone is learning a new language, there are some general things that will be difficult no matter which language that you're learning. So here I'm going to focus mainly on things that make specifically English difficult. First, as we talked about in the last video, English has a huge, diverse vocabulary. That is, in common usage in American English, there are about 110,000 words. Common usage means these are words that get used in newspapers, magazines, books, television, movies, etc. So this doesn't mean that every English speaker in America knows 110,000 words. It just means that they can expect to see 110,000 words in various places. Now, when a typical high school student graduates from high school in the United States, they know probably about 40,000 words. And it's actually that number of words that are needed to understand about 98 to 99% of the general things that they're going to hear and read in English. However, it would take a bare minimum of about 10,000 words, and that's not counting their suffixes and other distinctions. For example, if you have a noun, they would count the singular and the plural form as one word. So an English learner would need a minimum of 10,000 words to give them just a reasonable chance of understanding an academic text. And that doesn't mean reading it fluently or easily or understanding it very deeply. This is just a basic understanding. But what does it even mean to know a word? When we look at word knowledge, we can basically break it down into three categories. There's form, meaning, and use. So with form, that means the way the word is spoken, how it's pronounced, the way it's written, and what the parts of the word are, if we were to break it into its parts. For meaning, there is the connection between the form of the word and the meaning of the word. There's what the word signifies and what it refers to, and there's the other words that it's associated with. When we look at use, there's the grammatical function of the word, any collocations that it might have. Collocations are words that you often see together, and there are constraints on the use of the word. So in what situations is it appropriate to use the word? In what situations is it inappropriate? So for a native speaker, for most of their basic vocabulary, their brain will have information about all of these things. Now, if you learn a new word, for example, if you're reading a complicated book and you see a word you've never seen before, and maybe you look it up in the dictionary, then you've connected the form and the meaning. You know how it's spelled and you know basically what it means, but you're likely to forget the word and you're not going to have all of this other information about the word, which means it's less useful for you. Now, for a non-native speaker of English, they're going to be very limited in what they know about the word. So they might have the spoken form, they might have the written form, they might have the form and the meaning, but a lot of this other information is going to be basically blank in their minds. Now, for most of the language learners that I've worked with, they often say that understanding how to pronounce a word, being able to differentiate between its different meanings, for example, if a word means more than one thing, and how to use it in a sentence are the most difficult things for them to learn. So let's look a little bit more closely at form and meaning, for example. What does the word get mean? Well, get can mean to buy, like to get lunch. Get can mean to receive, like to get a gift. Get can mean become, like to get cold. Get can mean to think of, like to get an idea. Or get can mean to understand, like to get it. So if you're a non-native speaker of English, you might say, yeah, I know what the word get means, but they might only know one of these meanings of the word get, or maybe two of them, but probably not all of them, so, which can make the language a little bit confusing if they see the word get used in a situation that they've never experienced before. Next, let's look at vocabulary diversity in English. As I also mentioned in the last video, English has acquired a lot of vocabulary from Latin, French, and Greek, among other languages. And these words mainly get used in church language, in education, in government, and in science. Now, most of spoken English is Germanic, because as we saw in the first video, English is originally a Germanic language. However, written English is mostly derived from Latin, French, Greek, and a handful of other languages. 97% of the 100 most common words in English come from Germanic. This means that most of the words that somebody's going to hear and use in conversation come from Germanic. 57% of the 1,000 most common words also come from Germanic. So over half of the 1,000 most common words in English come from Germanic. So our base conversational vocabulary is mostly Germanic in American English. However, after the first 1,000 most common words in English, over 50% come from Latin, French, Greek, or other languages. So this makes it quite confusing for a language learner when they start to read, especially academic texts in English. Another thing that makes English difficult is the sound spelling correspondence, or how a word is pronounced versus how it's spelled. So think about this. How many vowels are there in English? You're probably thinking of 5 right now. A, E, I, O, U, and maybe a 6th, Y. However, when we look at vowels in English, English actually has 13 to 15 vowel sounds, depending on which reference you're looking at. However, most languages have between 5 and 7 vowel sounds. This means that if somebody is learning English, especially from a language that has fewer vowel sounds, they're probably not even going to notice the difference between many of the vowels in English, which will make it even more difficult for them to learn new vocabulary in English. Here's an example of the different vowels in English using colors. So I call it the color vowel chart. So we've got green tea, so we got the E sound. Silver pin, so we got the I sound. Gray day, so we've got the A sound. Red dress, so we've got the S sound. And so on it goes. So English is actually very wealthy when it comes to vowel sounds, but that is one thing that makes it difficult for language learners, is that there's too many vowels for them to differentiate between. Now, when we look at spelling, research has shown that English has the deepest orthography in terms of regularity and consistency. What this means is English is the most confusing language in the world when it comes to matching pronunciation with spelling, or even regularity in spelling or regularity in pronunciation. For example, let's take these 4 letters here, O-U-G-H. How do we pronounce them? Well, we can pronounce them like uff as in tough, oo as in through, o as in though, off as in cough, or ow as in drought. Now, if you're learning English and you know this word through, and you see this word up here, how are you going to pronounce it? To, or ku, or droot? So because there's no reference in the spelling itself, somebody who's learning English is going to have to learn the pronunciation basically through experience or through having access to a dictionary. What about this word? How do we pronounce it? Well, it depends. For example, in the sentence, I like to read books all the time, or in the sentence, I just read a good book last night. So this word can actually be pronounced 2 ways with the exact same spelling, depending on how it's used in the sentence, whether we're talking about the present or we're talking about the past. So unless you see it in a sentence and you know that it has 2 different pronunciations, you're not going to know exactly how to pronounce this word. Another thing that makes English difficult are the articles, that is the words a, an, and the, and prepositions, words like in, on, at, to, from, of, etc. English actually has about 94 single word prepositions. If we include 2 and 3 word prepositions, then it gets up to about 150, which is many more than many languages in the world. So it can be difficult for a language learner to know how to use these prepositions correctly, because a lot of it is basically just how we use it normally in the culture. For example, do I have a picture in my phone, or do I have a picture on my phone? Do I have you in my mind, or do I have you on my mind? Do I live at Main Street or on Main Street? So basically, a language learner has to have experience with using these words and seeing them in sentences before they can really understand how to use them. And then there's pronunciation. As I've mentioned before already, English pronunciation can be very quirky and confusing. One reason is that English is a stress-timed language. That means when we look at the syllables in a word or the syllables in a sentence, some of them are stressed and some of them are not stressed. So when a syllable or a word is stressed, we basically take longer to pronounce it or put more effort into pronouncing it. And the unstressed words or the unstressed syllables will get shortened when we're pronouncing it. So for example, I don't like to eat vegetables. So I'm stressing the words don't and vegetables, which means that these words in between get shortened. Like to eat, like to eat. Now, some languages are what they call syllable timed, which means that every syllable gets the exact same stress. Or other languages that are stress timed might have their stress in different places. Now, this might not seem like that big of a deal, but when native speakers are listening to what somebody's saying in English, they're often listening for the stress first, so that if the stress is in the wrong places in the sentence, then the person who's listening can often misunderstand what's being said. Also, when we change word forms in English, there's usually a sound stress change in the word. For example, if we take the word maintain, the second syllable is stressed, but when we change it into the noun maintenance, it's the first syllable that's stressed and the end part of the word is unstressed, which means it gets shortened. So the sounds of the vowels change as the stress changes in the word. And then there's the American R. So most languages in the world have some kind of an R, but most of those languages pronounce the R with the tip of the tongue. Whereas the American R, we pronounce it more in the back of the mouth, which can be quite a difficult thing to pronounce for non-native speakers because it's difficult to describe how we're forming the R with the tongue. So for a non-native speaker, they might say really or super or American. But in America, we say really and super and American. So the way that we pronounce the R is actually not that common when you look at the languages of the world. And then there are the TH sounds in English, like in the word this or think. So we've got 2 TH sounds. However, these TH sounds occur in only a minority of languages in the world. So for example, in the World Atlas of Languages, when they looked at 566 languages, there are over 7,000 languages in the world, but when they looked at 566 of them, only 43 of those languages had either of these sounds in them. So because most languages in the world don't have this sound, it can actually be quite difficult for non-native speakers to pronounce. And then there are consonant clusters in English, and this is kind of a feature of Germanic languages in general. Consonant clusters are when we get a group of consonants together in a word. So for example, try to pronounce the word twelfths or sixths or glimpsed. We can see that there's a stacking of consonants. Like here, there's the M, the P, the S, and the D sound here because we don't pronounce the E. So we've got 4 consonant sounds grouped together with no vowel sounds in between, which can be very difficult for many people learning English because many languages in the world will often go consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. So if somebody comes from a language like that, when they're trying to pronounce these clusters of consonants, they'll either drop some of the consonants or they'll add extra vowels in between to make it easier to pronounce. Another thing that makes English difficult is contracted, reduced, or connected speech. So this is what happens when it becomes a spoken language, because basically when we try to talk, we're trying to find the most efficient and shortest way to talk. So we end up contracting what we say, reducing it somehow, or connecting it in a smooth way. So for example, if we take the sentence, "What are you doing?" When we're speaking, we say, "What you doing?" At least in Minnesota we do. So these 4 words end up getting reduced into just kind of 2 sounds, "What you doing?" Or we get the woulda, coulda, shoulda thing. So we've got woulda, coulda, shoulda, or gonna. If we take the sentence, "If you would have helped me, I could have done better," it gets reduced or contracted to, "If you'd have helped me, I could have done better." So if you've studied English in a book, you're going to be used to this form. But when you hear a native English speaker talk, especially in America, you're going to hear these words here and you're going to think, I don't even know those words. What are they talking about? So it's difficult sometimes to connect these reduced forms to what the spelled form is. And then we have the common contractions of the apostrophe S, the apostrophe VE, and the apostrophe D. And when we're speaking quickly, we don't often clearly pronounce these endings on the words, and so non-native speakers can easily miss them. For example, if we say, "She's seen it already," because this next word in the sentence already has the S sound, they might not hear this apostrophe S ending on she's. So when they're learning the language, they're not picking up the grammar information. Or we've got this classic example from Kanye. Now, connected speech isn't about making a sentence shorter, it's about making it smoother to pronounce. So connected speech is an effect that happens when the sounds of a word get connected to the words before it or the words after it. For example, if we take this sentence, "How's it going?" it's going to sound like this, "How's it going?" So we reduce it by dropping the T sound, but because we have a consonant here, it kind of connects with the vowel there. So it connects together, making it sound like one word. So this is difficult because when you're listening, you can't hear the separation in between words. So if a non-native speaker of English hears something like this, especially with vocabulary they've never heard before, they're going to be confused about what word you're using. And even if they try to look up the word, they're not going to know how to spell it exactly because it was connected to a word before it or a word after it. Or for example, if we take this sentence, "Look at your right hand," when we pronounce it, we don't say it that way. We would say it something like, "Look at your right hand." Now, somebody listening to this might say, "What's look at your right?" But what's happening is these sounds are connecting together. And then over here, because we have a word that ends with the R and the next word begins with the R, it makes it sound like there's one R there. Also, we've got this T and this Y. These sounds end up mixing together and creating this ch sound. So because we've got these unspoken rules about pronunciation and connected speech, it makes it quite difficult for a language learner when they're listening to somebody talk, especially at a normal speed. Another thing that makes English difficult are collocations, phrasal verbs, slang, jargon, and idioms. Basically, these are the cultural uses of language. As I mentioned before, collocations are words that we often find together in listening or in reading. For example, if I'm going to use the noun noise, what verb am I going to use with this? Probably the verb make. Or if I use the noun bath, I'm probably going to use the verb have or take and not any other verbs. So because I can expect either this verb or the verb take with the noun bath, this is what we call a collocation. They're words that we often hear together or see together. And the only way to know, for example, which verb to use with which noun is basically through experience. So collocations can be very difficult for language learners because they have to have more and more experience with the language. And then there are phrasal verbs. So phrasal verbs are verbs that include more than one word. And for example, we use the word up with a lot of verbs without any clear reason why. So we can act up, we can add up, we can ante up, we can back up, we can bear up, we can beat up, etc., etc. So the verb act has quite a different meaning than the verb act up. So even though a language learner might know the word act and they might know the word up, they don't necessarily know the meaning of the words act up together. So phrasal verbs can be confusing because the language learner might think they know what the verb is saying, but they don't realize that when you put the words together, it turns it into a new meaning. And then there's slang. Slang is basically informal language used by specific groups of people. For example, teenagers use slang quite a bit. So if you're a language learner and you're not used to the informal language or the slang of the group of people you're hanging out with, then you're going to be quite confused about what they're talking about. And then there are idioms and jargon. So idioms are basically groups of words whose meaning is different than the meaning of the individual words in the idiom. And then there's jargon. Jargon is kind of like slang, but it's kind of the accepted slang of certain professional communities. So if we look at this transcript from a news program, this is about 1 minute of speaking if we were to say all of this. And within just this minute or 2 minutes, the speaker uses at least 7 different idioms or forms of jargon. So if you're a non-native speaker and you haven't heard any of these idioms before or don't know what the jargon is referring to, it's going to be confusing even to listen to a news program. Another thing that makes English difficult are irregular verbs and plural nouns. So irregular verbs and plural nouns are basically artifacts of the old grammar rules and spellings from Old English and Middle English, which we looked at in the first video. So for example, most of the most common verbs we use in everyday English are irregular, which means that their present form is going to be different than their past form. For example, we have the verb bite, but the past form of it is bit. Now, regular verbs, the past form will add a D or an ED on the end. But we don't say bited, we say bit. We don't say bide, we say bought. We don't say builded, we say built. So with these irregular verbs, there's no clear pattern that a language learner can follow to know what the irregular form is. That's why it's called irregular. So they basically have to learn these forms one by one as they learn the verbs. So for example, if they want to learn the verb drink, then they have to look up what the past form is. They can't just say drinked, or they'll get marked wrong on an assignment. Similar to this are plural nouns. So most nouns, when they're plural, we just add an S or an ES to them. But the irregular plural nouns, again, the ones we use most commonly in English, are spelled in different ways. For example, with child, we have children. With tooth, we have teeth. With leaf, we have leaves. And again, there's no clear pattern to most of these. So the language learner has to learn them as individual vocabulary words. They have to learn that women is the plural of woman. They have to learn that feet is the plural of foot. They can't just learn to add an S to the word. Another thing that makes English difficult is informal versus formal language, or common language versus academic language. For example, in common spoken English, we might say her car needed to be fixed. Whereas in academic English, we might say her automobile required repairs. In common spoken English, we might say, we've got to change how we do things. In academic English, we might say, we need to adjust our approach to the situation. So we can see that a language learner almost needs to learn 2 different sets of vocabulary, one for spoken language and one for written or formal language. Now in linguistics, we call the common spoken English BICS, and we call the academic language CALP. So BICS stands for Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills. This is the language used mainly for oral communication or speaking. And it usually takes about 2 years to understand it easily. But even then, there's going to be some gaps in what you understand, depending on what experience you have with the language. CALP stands for Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. So this is the language of the academic classroom, and it can take anywhere from 5 years to 7 years for learners to become proficient in this. The reason it takes so long is because academic language has fewer nonverbal clues, that is pictures, body language, things like that. There's less face-to-face interaction because they're learning a lot of it through books. Academic language that's used is often abstract, meaning we're talking about ideas such as poverty and wealth and war. And the literacy demands are high, which means they have to be well read in that subject before they can really fully understand what they're reading in an academic textbook. And cultural knowledge is often needed to understand what they're reading. So you can imagine how confusing it might be when you go to the gas station and see a warning like this on the pump, when you're used to hearing and using language like this on a normal daily basis. So what can language learners do about this? And what can we do to support them? That is, what can native speakers, especially school teachers and staff, do to facilitate smoother interactions with language learners and help them along in their language development? In the next video, we will look at some specific and practical solutions to help language learners deal with the difficulties discussed in this video. Thanks for watching.